Picture this: Versailles at its height, a palace of mirrors and gold where every hallway echoed with elegance and whispers. Behind silk-draped windows and candle-lit salons, Queen Marie Antoinette dazzled with beauty, jewels, and endless feasts. But each sparkle, each indulgence came with a price. For every pearl strung around her neck, another rumor spread like wildfire across France. To her supporters, she was the epitome of grace, but to her enemies she became the Austrian woman, a foreign queen blamed for bleeding the kingdom dry. She was accused of lavish banquets, secret lovers, and forbidden scandals so shocking that they threatened not only her crown, but the survival of the monarchy itself. If you enjoy uncovering history's darkest truths, subscribe to Secret Historians. Like this video, share your thoughts, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because these hidden stories connect us across centuries. What you're about to hear is not just the tale of a queen, but the unraveling of a kingdom caught between beauty, betrayal, and scandal. Imagine a queen whose beauty was rivaled only by her scandals, where every jewel, every feast, and every forbidden rumor pushed France closer to collapse. The year was 1770, and Versailles glittered brighter than ever before. Within its mirrored halls, under ceilings painted with gods and heroes, France welcomed a young Austrian princess named Marie Antoinette. Barely 14, she crossed the border from Vienna to marry the Dauphin Louis, grandson of the reigning king. It was a marriage designed not from love but from politics, a union between the Habsburg Empire and Bourbon France, meant to cement peace between rivals. But what arrived at Versailles was not merely a bride. It was a spark. From the beginning, the foreign princess was watched with suspicion. To the courtiers of Versailles, she was not Marie Antoinette, future Queen of France. She was the Austrian woman, an outsider, a stranger who carried with her the scent of Vienna and the weight of alliances. Even her grace could not silence whispers. They measured her gowns, her laughter, her every gesture, judging her not only as a Dauphine but as a symbol of foreign influence. Still, Marie was determined to dazzle. She embraced Versailles with youthful energy, charming some with her laughter, captivating many with her striking blue eyes and elaborate hairstyles. She danced, she smiled, she played the role expected of her, and yet beneath the golden chandeliers whispers never ceased. Was she frivolous? Was she extravagant? Was she loyal? The seeds of doubt had been sown. As years passed, her role grew heavier. In 1774, with the death of Louis XV, the Dauphin became Louis de Saint-Cyr, and the Austrian princess became Queen of France. Versailles erupted with celebration, but already shadows crept into the palace. Marie, barely 19, found herself at the center of a kingdom burdened by debt, restless with hunger, and quick to envy. The crown she wore glittered with diamonds, but beneath it lay the weight of suspicion. And here you must pause and wonder, what would it feel like to be so young, so adored, and yet so despised? To walk through halls of gold knowing that every step echoed with judgment? Would you retreat into silence, or would you, like Marie, fight whispers with spectacle? Versailles became her stage. Marie Antoinette embraced fashion not simply as vanity, but as armor. She adorned herself with towering pouf hairstyles decorated with ships, plumes, and jewels. She commissioned gowns of silk and satin, spending fortunes on fabrics imported from across Europe. To her it was expression, art, identity, defiance. To the people beyond Versailles' gilded gates it was provocation. While they starved, their queen sparkled, and soon the rumors grew. They said she gambled through the night, losing thousands in a single sitting. They said she hosted secret parties, reveling in champagne while peasants begged for bread. They whispered of lovers, both noblemen and women, of trysts in hidden chambers. Whether true or not mattered little. Perception was enough. One scandal in particular would haunt her for years: the affair of the diamond necklace. Though Marie Antoinette was innocent of the plot, which involved a cardinal and swindlers attempting to purchase a necklace worth more than most towns, her name was dragged through mud. Pamphlets across France painted her as greedy, vain, and corrupt, a queen who would bankrupt a nation for jewels. To the people, it did not matter that she never touched the necklace. The image of her draped in diamonds while children starved became truth. Imagine yourself in Paris then, standing in a crowded street reading one of those pamphlets. The woodcut shows the queen with diamonds glittering on her chest, goblet in hand, laughter on her lips. Do you believe the truth, that she was a victim of deceit, or do you believe the scandal, the story that matches your hunger, your anger, your envy? In times of suffering, rumor is stronger than fact. Versailles itself became a prison of contradictions. Inside, the queen sought refuge in her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, a small palace on the grounds where she played shepherdess, surrounded by gardens and fountains. She longed for simplicity, for escape from the suffocating rituals of court, but even this became scandal. Pamphlets mocked her for dressing in muslin gowns, for tending sheep as if she mocked the labor of peasants. What was meant as innocence was twisted into insult, and you, if you had been a peasant then, hungry, desperate, watching your queen play at shepherdess while you labored under the sun, would you have felt pity or rage? The storm grew heavier with every passing year. France's debt soared, wars drained coffers, and bread prices rose beyond reach. The people looked to their king for relief, but Louis XVI was indecisive, awkward, unable to command the moment. So they looked instead to their queen, and what they saw was not a woman but a symbol of all that was wrong. Foreign, extravagant, uncaring, let them eat cake. The phrase became legend, though she never spoke it. Attributed to her by angry pamphleteers, it captured the image of a queen blind to suffering, a monarch mocking the starving masses. The truth did not matter. The words became gospel of resentment. Inside Versailles, the queen still danced, still dazzled, still tried to hold the illusion of control. But beyond its gilded gates, the people sharpened their knives. Paris boiled with anger, fueled by rumor, scandal, and hunger. Every diamond she wore, every feast she attended, every whisper of a lover became tinder for the fire of revolution. And yet, Marie Antoinette remained defiant. She would not bow to whispers, would not surrender her pride. In her mind she was queen, chosen by God above the reach of pamphlets and peasants. But history had other plans. The torches of revolution were already being lit. The people's anger was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. And Versailles, once untouchable, would soon tremble beneath its sound. The year was 1789, and the ground beneath Versailles began to tremble. What had once seemed untouchable, the monarchy itself, now faced a tide of anger so fierce that even golden gates could not withstand it. France was drowning in debt. Bread prices soared and famine haunted villages. Rumors of the queen's extravagance traveled faster than truth, carried in pamphlets and songs that mocked her as Madame Deficit. For Marie Antoinette, life in Versailles had become an endless battle against perception. She had never wielded political power in the way pamphleteers claimed, yet she became the lightning rod for the nation's fury. Every gown she wore, every pearl on her neck, every whisper of a lover was painted as betrayal. To the people, she was not just a queen, she was the enemy. Inside Versailles, the queen sought comfort in her circle of friends. She retreated to the Petit Trianon, where she hosted private gatherings far from the rigid etiquette of court. There she laughed, played cards, and surrounded herself with those she trusted. But even this sanctuary betrayed her. To the masses, these retreats were not innocence but decadence. proof that the queen cared nothing for her suffering subjects. Imagine being one of those peasants, walking barefoot into Paris markets, staring at bread you could not afford, while hearing songs mocking your queen for feasting on delicacies. How would you have felt? Would anger have filled your chest, or despair? Would you have believed she was the cause of your hunger, or simply the symbol of it? By the summer of 1789, anger ignited into action. The Bastille fell and the revolution began. In pamphlets and speeches, the queen became the villainess of the story. Her Austrian birth, once a diplomatic asset, now branded her as traitor. She was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, of plotting against the people. Whether true or not mattered little. The image was enough. And here lies the tragedy. Marie Antoinette had little power to change the course of events. Louis XVI hesitated, delayed, and faltered while his queen bore the brunt of hatred. She was painted as manipulative, seductive, corrupt, and foreign. Every story, whether of gambling debts or forbidden lovers, became proof. She was no longer Marie Antoinette, the woman. She was the scapegoat for a nation's suffering. The storm reached Versailles in October 1789. Parisian women, enraged by the scarcity of bread, marched to the palace. Armed with pitchforks, knives, and fury, they surged through the gates. Inside, chaos erupted. Guards fell, blood-stained marble, and the queen's chambers were stormed. Marie barely escaped, fleeing through secret corridors as intruders slashed her bed to shreds. Picture her in that moment, running through gilded halls, the echo of footsteps behind her, her heart pounding with terror. For years she had been the Queen of France, untouchable in silk and jewels. Now she was prey, hunted in her own palace by those who once bowed before her. Dragged before the crowd, she stood on the balcony of Versailles. The mob demanded her presence, their voices rising like thunder. She appeared, pale but composed, bowing her head in defiance rather than submission. Some shouted to kill her, others fell silent at her courage. In that instant, the queen who had been mocked for frivolity stood face to face with revolution, and for a brief moment silence fell. And you? Had you been in that crowd, staring up at her on the balcony, would you have raised your fist in fury, or would you have felt a flicker of pity for a woman suddenly stripped of her illusions? The royal family was taken from Versailles, escorted under guard to Paris. No longer masters of a palace, they were now prisoners of the people. The gilded halls were behind them, and before them stretched the shadow of revolution. In the Tuileries palace, the queen's world shrank. Guards monitored her every step, pamphlets vilified her every move, and whispers of conspiracy never ceased. Yet she remained defiant. She counseled her husband to resist, to stand firm, to reclaim power. But Louis hesitated, indecisive as ever, while the revolution grew bolder. Soon, pamphlets painted her as more than frivolous. They painted her as monstrous. She was accused of incest with her son, of seducing ministers, of plotting to massacre her people. The truth no longer mattered. The queen had become a myth of corruption, a symbol that revolutionaries wielded like a weapon. By 1791, desperation drove the royal family to flee. Disguised, they slipped into the night, a carriage carrying their hopes of escape. But at Varennes they were discovered. The King and Queen of France, once divine rulers, were dragged back as captives. Paris roared with rage. The monarchy's illusion was shattered, its dignity gone. And you, if you had been among those who stopped the carriage, would you have seen criminals trying to betray your revolution, or frightened parents seeking safety for their children? The Queen's scandals, real or imagined, only grew darker. Songs mocked her, pamphlets slandered her, plays caricatured her as lustful and cruel. She became l'Autrichienne, the Austrian bitch, an object of hatred beyond redemption. Yet still she held her head high. Even as the revolution grew bloodier, As the guillotine claimed nobles and priests, Marie Antoinette carried herself with dignity. To her enemies it was arrogance. To her supporters it was courage. To history it remains a paradox. The revolution had begun as a cry for bread, for liberty, for equality. But by the time the Queen stood as prisoner in Paris, it had become something darker, a hunger for vengeance. And at the center of it stood Marie Antoinette, the Queen whose beauty had been rivaled only by her scandals, and whose scandals now threatened to consume her life. The blade of the guillotine had not yet fallen, but its shadow already stretched across her path. The Tuileries Palace in Paris became Marie Antoinette's gilded prison. Once the Queen of France walked freely through the endless halls of Versailles, surrounded by courtiers and musicians. Now she paced narrow corridors under the watch of armed guards. Outside, the chants of revolutionaries echoed through the streets, their songs mocking her beauty, her accent, her extravagance. Every day she was reminded that she was no longer adored but despised. In pamphlets her face appeared distorted, her figure caricatured with grotesque exaggeration. She was accused of everything imaginable, draining the treasury, corrupting morals, betraying the nation. Some pamphlets claimed she had lovers hidden in secret rooms. Others accused her of unspeakable crimes with her children. Truth and rumor blurred until they became indistinguishable, and the Queen was no longer a woman but a monster in the eyes of the people. And you, if you had lived in Paris then, would you have believed these stories? Or would you have doubted that a queen, locked away behind guarded gates, could be guilty of such sins? Would hunger and anger have silenced your doubt? Marie Antoinette responded to hatred with defiance. She refused to bow her head, refused to appear broken. In letters to foreign allies, she begged for intervention, urging her family in Austria to send armies, pleading for rescue. She knew her survival depended not on the love of her subjects, but on the power of foreign kings. To revolutionaries, this was proof of her treachery. To her, it was her only hope. In 1792, war erupted between France and Austria. The Queen was accused of conspiring with the enemy, branded a traitor in pamphlets and speeches. Her foreign birth, once a fragile link between empires, became a weapon against her. She was no longer just the Austrian woman. She was now the Austrian spy. Every defeat on the battlefield, every rumor of betrayal was pinned upon her. Inside the Tuileries, the royal family lived under constant threat. Crowds gathered outside, chanting for their deaths. Guards debated their loyalty, some whispering revolution, others still bowing to the crown. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with tension, as if history were pressing against the stones. On August 10, 1792, the storm finally broke. Revolutionaries armed with muskets, pikes, and fury surged into Paris. They stormed the Tuileries, cutting down royal guards, their cries echoing through the chambers. Blood stained the palace floors, smoke filled the halls, and chaos reigned. The royal family fled through hidden passages, clutching their children as the mob roared. Picture Marie Antoinette in that moment, her gown torn, her hair disheveled, holding her young son's hand as soldiers screamed, and shots rang through marble corridors. Once she had been the symbol of Versailles' splendor. Now she was a hunted woman, chased through her own palace by the fury of a nation. Dragged before the Legislative Assembly, the king and queen were stripped of their power. The monarchy was declared suspended. France was no longer theirs to rule, it belonged to the people. The once gilded family was imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress that became their cage. Life in the Temple was bleak. Gone were the silks, the jewels, the feasts. Marie Antoinette now wore plain dresses, tended to her children, and endured the endless insults of guards. Her son, the Dauphin, grew ill in the damp cells, his cries echoing through stone walls. Her daughter clung to her, frightened and confused. The queen who once dazzled in diamonds now struggled to comfort her children with whispered lullabies in the dark. And you, if you had stood outside the temple, hearing the cries of the royal children, would you have felt pity, or would anger have silenced compassion, reminding you of breadless days and hunger that had no lullaby? In January 1793, Louis XVI was brought to trial. Accused of treason, he faced the guillotine. Marie watched as her husband, awkward and hesitant in life, walked with dignity to his death. The blade fell and France roared with approval. The king was gone. The monarchy was shattered. And Marie Antoinette was left a widow, a foreign queen without power, alone in a city that hated her. Her grief was immense, but her pride endured. She refused to collapse, refused to weep before her enemies. She carried herself with the dignity of a queen even in chains. Some guards mocked her. Others secretly admired her composure. To her supporters she became almost saintly in suffering. To her enemies she was still the Austrian traitor, awaiting her own judgment. The revolution, however, was not finished with her. In the eyes of the new republic, her existence was dangerous. As long as she lived, monarchists could rally around her name. As long as she breathed, she was a threat. And so whispers grew louder. Marie Antoinette must die. The guillotine loomed closer. The temple fortress stood cold and unyielding, its stone walls absorbing the cries of a broken monarchy. Within its damp chambers, Marie Antoinette lived not as a queen but as a prisoner, her crown replaced by silence, her silks replaced by coarse gowns. Yet even stripped of power, she carried herself with dignity, her back straight, her gaze unflinching. For some, this was arrogance. For others, it was courage. But for all, it was fuel. Her children clung to her in the dim light of the cells. The Dauphin, once heir to France, now whimpered from illness and neglect. Her daughter pressed against her side, seeking warmth in the chill air. Guards watched constantly, some jeering, some pitying, some unmoved. The queen who once commanded attention with diamonds and dances now fought to comfort her children with whispered stories of better days. And you, imagine being one of those guards. Would you have mocked her, seeing in her suffering the revenge of a hungry people, or would you have felt a pang of pity, watching a mother cradle her child in a prison too cold for royalty, too harsh for innocence? The revolution outside grew more violent by the day. The guillotine became a symbol not only of justice but of fear. Nobles, priests, and ordinary citizens alike fell beneath its blade. Paris thrummed with both triumph and terror, the streets echoing with chants of liberty even as blood stained the cobblestones. For many, the queen remained the ultimate prize, the head that would prove the revolution's power. Pamphlets painted her as a monster. They called her Madame Deficit, l'Autrichienne, and worse. They accused her of draining France's wealth, of sleeping with ministers, of incest with her own son. The charges grew more lurid, more grotesque, until she ceased to be human at all. She was a symbol, a scapegoat, a vessel into which all the nation's anger was poured. Still, Marie Antoinette did not collapse. She wrote letters to her family in Austria, pleading for her children's safety. She carried herself with poise when guards entered her cell. Even in despair, she refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken. To her enemies, this was defiance. To her supporters, it was martyrdom. In July 1793, the blow fell hardest when her son, the Dauphin, was taken from her. Revolutionaries declared he would be re-educated as a true citizen of France. Separated from his mother, the boy's cries echoed down the corridors, breaking her heart. He was placed under harsh conditions, subjected to manipulation, and denied his mother's comfort. For Marie Antoinette, this was the cruelest wound of all, not her own fate, but the suffering of her children. And you, if you had been in that chamber, watching her son dragged away, what would you have done? Would you have turned your eyes, complicit in cruelty? Or would you have dared to intervene knowing intervention meant death? By October, the decision was made. Marie Antoinette was to stand trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Her charges included treason, conspiring with foreign powers, and the most grotesque of all, incest with her son. The accusations shocked even some of her enemies, who knew them for the slanders they were. But truth no longer mattered. The trial was not about justice. It was about spectacle. She was led into the courtroom, pale yet composed, wearing a plain white gown. The hall erupted with jeers, but she did not falter. Witnesses spoke against her. Pamphlets were waved in the air, accusations spilled like venom. And then came the most vile charge, that she had committed incest with her young son. For the first time, her composure broke. She raised her voice not in denial, but in defense of motherhood itself. If I have not answered, it is because nature herself refuses to respond to such a charge. I appeal to all mothers here. Can you believe such horror? The room fell silent. Even hardened revolutionaries shifted uncomfortably. For a brief moment, the Queen's humanity pierced through the propaganda. But it was not enough. The verdict was inevitable. She was declared guilty. Her sentence, death by guillotine. That night, Marie Antoinette wrote her final letter. Addressed to her sister-in-law, she poured her soul onto the page. She forgave her enemies, prayed for her children, and declared her innocence. She asked only that her children remember her love. The letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted and hidden away. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she prepared for her execution. She dressed in a plain white gown, her hair shorn, her dignity intact. Guards shackled her hands, and she was placed in a simple cart, the same used to carry common criminals. Crowds lined the streets as the cart rumbled through Paris. Some jeered, some spat, others watched in silence. Picture her in that cart. Once a queen in gilded halls, now a condemned woman jolted along cobblestones. She sat upright, eyes forward, refusing to bow. Around her swirled a city that once adored her and now demanded her blood. Did she feel terror? Did she feel rage? Or did she, as some witnesses claimed, feel only a calm resignation, as if she knew her story was already written? The cart reached the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine loomed tall, its blade gleaming in the morning light. Drums rolled, drowning the murmurs of the crowd. She was led up the steps, her chains clinking with each movement. At the top she stumbled, accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me," she said softly. "I did not do it on purpose." These were her final words. And then the blade fell. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some wept, some stood in silence. The Queen was gone, her head held aloft for all to see. France had slain its monarch not only in body but in spirit. But history did not end there. For even as her blood stained the cobblestones, her legend began to grow. To some, she was the symbol of tyranny and corruption, the queen who played while her people starved. To others, she was a martyr, a woman slandered and destroyed by lies. And you, standing in that crowd watching her fall, what would you have felt? Triumph, justice, or the uneasy chill of realizing that with her death, France had crossed a line it could never return from? The guillotine blade was silent now, but its echo would haunt Europe forever. The blade had fallen and the crowd roared, but in that roar there was more than triumph. There was hunger, vengeance, relief, and unease. Marie Antoinette's head was lifted for all to see, her pale face now silent. Her story ended in flesh, but alive in memory. The revolution had claimed its ultimate prize, yet France itself trembled with uncertainty. Her death marked more than the fall of a queen. It marked the symbolic execution of monarchy itself. The centuries-old bond between ruler and ruled had been severed in an instant. The streets of Paris were flooded with pamphlets celebrating her demise, caricatures mocking her beauty, and speeches hailing liberty's triumph. Yet behind the chance, whispers persisted. Had justice truly been done, or had France crossed a threshold into bloodlust? And you? If you had stood among that crowd, your breath clouding in the autumn air, would you have cheered at the sight of her head? Or would you have felt the unsettling weight of history shifting, realizing you were part of a moment that could never be undone? The execution did not silence her story. In fact, it magnified it. Marie Antoinette became a legend in death. To revolutionaries, she was proof of tyranny destroyed. To monarchists, she was a martyr, a queen who faced her fate with dignity. Across Europe, her end sent shockwaves. Courts that had once envied Versailles now shuddered. If France could slay its queen, what ruler was safe? Rumors swirled even after her death. Some whispered that her body had been desecrated, others that her spirit haunted the corridors of the Tuileries. Foreign newspapers painted her as both villain and victim, each bending her story to their purpose. In Vienna, her family mourned, while in Paris her name was still cursed in the streets. Truth dissolved into myth, and myth became history. Her children left behind bore the cruelest fate. The Dauphin, Louis Charles, once heir to France, wasted away in prison. Revolutionary guards denied him comfort, subjected him to neglect, and eventually the boy died alone, a silent casualty of vengeance. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived, but scarred forever by the trauma of imprisonment, execution, and loss. For them, their mother's death was not only the end of a queen, but the destruction of a family. The revolution pressed on, but it grew darker. The guillotine did not rest after the queen's death, it grew busier. Nobles, priests, revolutionaries themselves all fell to its blade. The reign of terror had begun, and in many ways Marie Antoinette's execution was its opening act. The woman who had been mocked as frivolous now became a marker in history's descent into blood. Pamphleteers who once mocked her now found themselves in danger. Revolutionary leaders who shouted for her head now faced the same blade. The irony was bitter. In killing the queen for corruption and excess, the revolution revealed its own hunger for violence. Marie Antoinette's head had been lifted to the crowd as victory, but it was also a warning. And you? Imagine standing in Paris weeks later, watching the guillotine claim more and more lives. Would you still believe the queen's death had been justice, or would doubt creep in? Would you wonder if she had been the cause of France's suffering, or simply the scapegoat of its rage? In Austria, her family painted her as a martyr. Portraits of Marie Antoinette draped in white circulated, her death mourned as injustice. Monarchies across Europe clung tighter to their crowns, fearing the contagion of revolution. The Austrian court whispered of revenge, though their armies faltered against France's fury. Her story became political weapon as much as personal tragedy. The revolutionaries, however, needed her to remain a villain. They kept her name alive in pamphlets, repeating the stories of her extravagance, her supposed cruelty, her imagined crimes. To justify their cause, they could not allow her dignity to eclipse her scandal. And yet eyewitnesses spoke differently. They told of her calm at the scaffold, her composure, her final words of apology to the executioner. The contrast deepened the paradox. Was she a monster, or was she a queen who met death with courage? Time blurred the answer. The revolution thundered on, consuming itself while Marie Antoinette's ghost lingered. Versailles stood empty, its mirrors reflecting silence instead of laughter. The Petit Trianon gardens grew wild, untended, as if nature itself mourned the woman who once played shepherdess there. Paris, meanwhile, carried her memory in songs, jokes, and laments. She had once been the most hated woman in France, yet in death, pity began to creep in. Some whispered that perhaps she had been more victim than villain. a young woman trapped in a system already doomed. Others argued she had earned her fate, the symbol of a monarchy that had grown blind to its people. History itself became divided, torn between condemnation and sympathy. And you, sitting centuries later, do you see her as the architect of her own downfall, or as a scapegoat for a kingdom already collapsing? Was she guilty of greed or guilty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Her story did not end in 1793. It continued in art, in literature, in the memory of France. Playwrights turned her into tragedy. Novelists painted her as heroine, and revolutionaries kept her as cautionary tale. Even now, her name evokes both diamonds and guillotines, silk gowns and prison cells, frivolity and dignity. Few figures in history embody contradiction so perfectly. Yet perhaps the cruelest irony of all was this. Marie Antoinette, accused of draining France into ruin, left no fortune behind. She died in a plain white gown, with nothing but the dignity she clung to in her final moments. The jewels were gone, the feast forgotten, the power shattered. In the end, she was only a woman, standing before a blade, facing death as countless others did in that bloody age. The revolution continued to devour itself, but the queen's shadow remained. Her fall was not only the fall of a monarch, but the beginning of a new world. And in that new world, her memory was both warning and legend. The blade of the guillotine had silenced her voice, but history would never stop speaking her name. The Place de la Révolution was washed clean of her blood, yet Marie Antoinette's shadow lingered in Paris like a stain that no rain could remove. The guillotine had claimed her body, but her name echoed louder than ever. Songs mocked her, pamphlets twisted her story, and whispers of her final words circulated through taverns and salons. The revolution needed her dead, but it needed her legend even more. To the radical Jacobins, she remained the embodiment of tyranny. Her memory justified the blood that continued to flow, the endless march of victims to the guillotine. They painted her as greedy, frivolous, treacherous, a foreign parasite who had bled France dry. Every pamphlet that mocked her became a weapon. Each caricature of her towering hair and jeweled gowns a reminder of why the revolution had been necessary. But outside France, her image transformed. In Austria, she was remembered as a daughter lost, a victim of barbarism. In England, newspapers portrayed her as a tragic queen, a martyr of liberty gone mad. Across Europe, monarchies trembled, not only at the sight of the guillotine but at the reminder that crowns could fall as easily as hers had. Her death was a mirror in which kings and queens saw their own doom. And you, if you were a monarch in Europe at that moment, would you have tightened your grip on power, or would you have reformed, fearing your own people's wrath? The irony of Marie Antoinette's death was that it solved nothing for France. Bread remained scarce, debt unrelieved, hunger unappeased. Executing a queen did not bake loaves or fill coffers. Instead, it fed the revolution's hunger for blood. The guillotine became insatiable, its blade descending day after day. Nobles, priests, even revolutionaries themselves fell in turn. The terror had begun, and Marie's death was only its prologue. For the royal family, the tragedy deepened. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, remained imprisoned, isolated and scarred by trauma. Her son, Louis-Charles the Dauphin, became a victim of cruelty unimaginable. Guards subjected him to neglect, filth, and deliberate psychological torment. By 1795, the boy was dead, his small body broken by illness and abuse. The monarchy's bloodline had been extinguished in a cell, its heirs erased not by politics but by suffering. Imagine Marie Antoinette's torment had she lived to witness it. Her son, heir to France, reduced to a child coughing in the dark, his cries unheard. Would she have felt guilt, rage, despair, or all three entwined? Her daughter survived, but her survival was a cage of memory. Released years later, she carried with her the scars of imprisonment, the loss of parents, the shame of rumors that painted her family as monsters. She never escaped her mother's shadow, nor the weight of a crown that had dissolved into ash. Meanwhile, pamphlets continued to circulate, rewriting Marie's story even as her body lay in an unmarked grave. Some depicted her as a harlot, others as a saint. The revolution itself could not decide whether she had been destroyed as a tyrant or sacrificed as a scapegoat. Her image was clay molded by whoever told her story. And you, listening now centuries later, what do you believe? That she was guilty of decadence, deserving of her fate, or that she was a young woman, trapped by politics and slander, destroyed by forces larger than herself? As the years passed, her memory evolved. During the Bourbon Restoration, when monarchy returned to France, she was mourned as a martyr. Monuments were built, her remains reburied with dignity at Saint-Denis beside her husband. The woman once mocked as Madame Deficit was now honored as a queen. Yet the revolution's mark never faded. To Republicans, she remained the foreign queen who symbolized excess. To monarchists, she was proof of revolutionary cruelty. To historians, she became the face of contradiction. Versailles itself stood silent, its halls empty of laughter and music. The Petit Trianon, once her sanctuary, became a haunting relic. Tourists and mourners alike wandered its gardens, imagining the queen in muslin gowns tending sheep, a dreamer in a world collapsing. The mirrors of Versailles still reflected gold and grandeur, but for many they also reflected the ghosts of a queen's fall. Marie Antoinette's story endured because it was more than her own. It was the story of a kingdom blind to suffering, of a people desperate for justice, of a revolution devouring itself. She was both cause and consequence, symbol and victim, guilty and innocent. Few figures in history carry such contradictions with them into eternity. Her legacy became a cautionary tale. Monarchs who ignored their people's hunger risked her fate. Rulers who indulged in extravagance risked becoming symbols of tyranny. And yet her grace at the scaffold inspired others, proving that even in defeat dignity could endure. And so history leaves us with questions more than answers. Was Marie Antoinette destroyed for her own sins or for the sins of monarchy itself? Was she the villain of France's collapse or its scapegoat? Was she a frivolous queen or a tragic martyr? The revolution moved on, but it could never erase her. Her name remains etched into the story of France. Her face still gazes from portraits, her myth still divides opinion. The guillotine silenced her voice, but the echo of her fall shaped a new world. And you? Centuries later, as you hear her story, what do you feel? Pity, anger, curiosity? Does she strike you as warning or as tragedy? Perhaps both, because some stories, no matter how bloodily they end, never fade. The revolution had silenced Marie Antoinette, but her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Paris moved forward, yet the memory of the queen lingered in every pamphlet, every whispered story, every uneasy silence. She was gone, but she was also everywhere, haunting a nation that could not agree on what she had meant. Some Parisians toasted her death in taverns, convinced that liberty had triumphed over tyranny. Others muttered that her execution had unleashed something darker, that France had traded one form of oppression for another. The reign of terror deepened, its blade indiscriminate, and many who once demanded the queen's head soon lost their own beneath the guillotine. The revolution devoured not only kings and queens but its own children. And you, if you had lived through those days, would you have felt safer without a queen? Or would you have wondered if you had opened a door that could never again be closed? Outside of France, her story twisted into legend. In Vienna, her family mourned her as a victim of savagery. In London, newspapers published sentimental tales of her final dignity, portraying her as a tragic heroine. Across Europe, monarchs used her fate as a warning, proof that unchecked revolution could topple even the most glittering crowns. For rulers clinging to their thrones, her memory was not just sad, it was terrifying. But within France, pamphlets did not stop. They mocked her memory with caricatures, painted her as a monster who had corrupted France with greed and lust. To keep the revolution alive, she could not be allowed to become a martyr. She had to remain the villain. Yet the more they tried to bury her under scandal, the more contradictions surfaced. Eyewitnesses who had watched her face the guillotine whispered about her calm, her courage, her composure. The villain became in some eyes a woman of tragic strength. Versailles itself stood as her silent monument. Its halls were empty, its mirrors reflecting only dust and ghosts. The Petit Trianon, once her sanctuary, grew wild with neglect. Visitors walked the gardens and felt the absence like a presence. The shepherdess queen who had once laughed there, now only a memory. The palace, designed to glorify kings and queens, now testified to their downfall. The revolution claimed her children as well. Her son's death in the temple cell became another wound carved into history. His body, wasted by neglect and cruelty, was mourned even by some who had despised his mother. He was, after all, only a child. Her daughter survived, but she carried with her the unbearable scars of memory. Released years later, she lived in exile, the sole survivor of a family erased by history's fury. And you, imagine being that daughter, standing at your mother's grave years later. Would you remember her as the queen mocked in pamphlets, or as the mother who held your hand in the darkness of a prison cell? Which truth would you cling to, and which would you let go? As decades passed, the queen's story became a battlefield of memory. Monarchists sanctified her, building her into a martyr of innocence destroyed by revolution. Republicans demonized her, keeping her alive as a warning against royal excess. Artists painted her, poets wrote of her, playwrights dramatized her. Each retelling bent her image until the real woman disappeared behind layers of myth. In the Bourbon Restoration, her body was reburied in the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, laid beside her husband with solemn ceremony. Crowds gathered, some weeping, some curious, all aware they were witnessing not just a burial, but a rewriting of history. The woman once mocked as Madame Deficit was now remembered with hymns and incense. Yet beneath the chants, questions lingered. Had France sought justice or vengeance? Her memory haunted revolutions to come. In 1830, in 1848, in 1871, the people of Paris remembered the guillotine, remembered the queen. Each new upheaval carried echoes of her fall. Her face stared from engravings, her story retold in whispers and debates. She became both weapon and warning, symbol and scapegoat. And you, centuries later, when you hear her name, what do you see? A frivolous queen in diamonds and silk, or a frightened woman facing a blade with dignity? History leaves the choice to you, but either way, her presence is inescapable. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette was not just her death, it was her transformation. From princess to queen, from queen to scapegoat, from scapegoat to legend, she lived a life consumed by rumor, and in death she became rumor itself, endlessly reshaped by those who needed her for their cause. The revolution had silenced her voice, but it could not silence her story. And in that silence, a greater question arose. Had France killed a queen, or had it killed its own reflection, the very excess it despised in itself? The answer was as elusive as her ghost, which still seemed to walk the corridors of Versailles. Centuries after the guillotine silenced her, Marie Antoinette's name still hangs heavy in history. She is remembered not only as a queen, but as a question. What did she truly represent? To some, she was the careless monarch who mocked her starving people. To others, she was the tragic victim of slander and circumstance, destroyed by forces far beyond her control. Her story is both a mirror and a warning, shimmering with contradiction. Even in her lifetime, truth was lost in rumor. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," still clings to her name, though no evidence proves she ever said it. It was propaganda, designed to ignite fury, yet it endured as if it were gospel. That is the power of rumor. It survives longer than fact, and it can bury reality in a shroud of myth. And you? How often have you believed a story simply because it felt true even if it was not? Imagine being a peasant in 1789, hungry, desperate, hearing those words in the market. Would you have cared if they were real, or would anger have made them truth enough? After her death, art and literature turned her into a figure of endless fascination. In plays, she was portrayed as a frivolous villainess. In poems, as a martyred queen. Portraits of her circulated across Europe, some showing her with jewels and towering hair, others in plain white gowns, dignified in suffering. The real woman vanished beneath the layers of interpretation, each version serving the agenda of the age. Versailles, too, became a stage for her ghost. Tourists wandered its mirrored halls, imagining the queen dancing beneath chandeliers or fleeing through secret passages as the mob stormed. The Petit Trianon, once mocked as her playground, grew into a shrine of melancholy where visitors felt the weight of her absence. The palace stood not just as a monument to monarchy, but as a mausoleum of her story. Her daughter, Marie Thérèse, carried the memory of her mother into exile. She lived long enough to see monarchies fall and rise again. But she never escaped the shadow of the temple prison. She rarely spoke of her parents, but her silence itself was a testament to the scars. Through her, the blood of the Bourbons survived, yet always stained by the memory of revolution. Across Europe, monarchs invoked Marie Antoinette's name to warn their subjects. This is what happens, they implied, when kings forget their people, or when people forget their kings. She became both justification for reform and justification for repression. Her image was wielded like a sword, cutting in every direction. And you, standing centuries later, do you see her as victim or villain? Is she the reckless queen who danced as her people starved? Or the scapegoat sacrificed to satisfy their rage? Perhaps she was both, and perhaps that is why her story endures. Even in popular culture today, her ghost lingers. Films, novels, and documentaries continue to reimagine her. Some show her as the fashion icon, draped in silks and diamonds. Others portray her as the tragic young woman, overwhelmed and doomed. Each retelling chooses a version of her, but none can capture her entirely. The contradictions remain. That is the true legacy of Marie Antoinette. She is not one story, but many. She is innocence and guilt, beauty and scandal, dignity and downfall. She is a queen who destroyed a kingdom, or a kingdom that destroyed its queen. And so her name continues to echo. In classrooms, in palaces, in whispers, in arguments. She stands at the crossroads of myth and reality, an eternal question mark in history's pages. But perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: was her death the justice of a people, or the vengeance of a mob? Did France slay tyranny, or did it slay a woman who never had the power to stop its collapse? The guillotine's blade is silent now, rusted and gone. The crowds are dust. Versailles is a museum, its mirrors reflecting strangers instead of queens. Yet when you walk those halls, when you see her portraits, when you whisper her name, the air still trembles with the memory of her fall. The revolution ended her life, but it did not end her story. Because some stories refuse to die, and you, hearing her tale now, centuries later, do you see warning or tragedy? Do you feel anger or pity? Or do you perhaps feel the unease of knowing that history repeats itself, and that her fate could belong to any ruler who forgets the fragile bond between power and people? That is the legacy of Marie Antoinette. Not only the jewels, the feasts, the scandals, but the echo of a blade, and the questions it left behind.